Okay, so Easter. Um, we all know about the bunnies and the eggs and maybe going to church, but like, have you ever really thought about how all that came together?
Yeah, it's interesting.
So that's what we're doing today, this deep dive. We've got some really fascinating material
Oh, yes.
from YouTube transcripts from Amazing Discoveries with Walter Weiss, and then another one from SDA Church Abukwa.
Right.
And basically our mission is to like really dig in and see what Easter is all about,
Right.
Not just this, the surface stuff, but like where did it come from?
Yeah.
So we're going to look at, obviously it's connected to like the core of what Christians believe.
Right.
But also maybe to some stuff that's a lot older, like pre-Christian practices.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right into this.
I think it's really interesting that the core of Easter, from a Christian perspective, is the resurrection of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. That's like the big thing that Christians all over the world, that's what they're celebrating.
Yeah, it's like the fundamental meaning.
But when you start to like dig into the history of it, especially how it's connected to, ancient Jewish traditions, it gets a little more complex.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
The transcripts really highlight the importance of Passover in ancient Jewish life.
Right.
And unlike a lot of our modern holidays where, it's just like March, whatever.
Yeah, it's a fixed date.
It's a fixed date. Passover wasn't fixed to a particular day of the week.
Yeah.
It was actually determined by the lunar cycle.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So when they saw the new moon every month, that's kind of how they figured out when Passover was.
Oh, that's really interesting. So because it was tied to the moon, it wasn't tied to a specific day of the week.
Right, exactly.
Like our holidays are today.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets super interesting.
Yeah.
So the sources point out that the resurrection of Jesus happened to be the day after a literal seventh-day Sabbath during Passover.
Oh, wow.
So like this connection to the Jewish calendar and the Passover festival is so important for understanding what was going on back then.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
In those early days.
Yeah, it's like the context you need to understand.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, the Amazing Discoveries transcript mentions that the early followers of Jesus used Nisan 14 to figure out their own observances.
Okay.
And Nisan 14 is just the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan.
Great.
Which is when Passover happens.
Okay, got it.
So in the beginning, they were kind of aligned. They were using the same timing to commemorate these huge events.
Right, but that didn't last though, did it?
No, it didn't.
Something happened in Rome that really changed things.
Yeah, so the Amazing Discoveries transcript brings up this really pivotal moment where the Bishop of Rome basically standardized the celebration of the resurrection.
Okay.
And the big change was this mandate that it should always be on a Sunday.
Oh, wow.
Regardless of, where it fell in relation to the Jewish lunar calendar and Passover.
That's a huge shift, to like deliberately move away from that original timing.
Totally. And it wasn't just like a suggestion or anything.
Right. It was a rule.
Yeah, the transcript makes it really clear that this was like a firm rule and there were actually consequences if you didn't follow it.
Oh, wow.
So this decision is really why we see this split today in how these events are commemorated.
Now, the discussion gets into some really cool stuff.
Okay.
It's about the idea that Easter, like the way we celebrate it now actually has connections to some really ancient pagan rituals.
Right, and this is something that both of our transcripts bring up.
Yeah.
It's this argument that the traditions we see with Easter today are linked to the feast of Ishtar, or Isa, who was this ancient pagan goddess.
Okay, and the Amazing Discoveries transcript really paints this picture of the mythology, like Ishtar descending in a cosmic egg.
Yeah.
And that's supposed to be why eggs are such a big deal.
Right, that connection isn't something that a lot of people think about when they see Easter eggs.
Yeah.
And it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
The transcript talks about the pagan celebration of the death and resurrection of Tammuz. So the argument is that modern Easter has kind of absorbed all of these pre-Christian pagan elements.
Right.
So you end up with this blend of, commemorating Jesus's resurrection with all this other stuff.
So it's like they're saying that what they call pagan Easter isn't actually in the Bible.
Right.
And it's separate from the Passover context and the day of the resurrection.
Yeah, the first fruits, as they call it.
Yeah, which is this really important idea in Jewish tradition, like, offering the first part of the harvest to God.
Yeah.
So basically what they're saying is that Easter, with all the bunnies and the eggs and all that stuff,
Right.
has moved away from where it started, the Bible and all that.
Exactly.
Okay, so the SDA Church Abukwa transcript brings up something else that's really interesting, and it's kind of a big deal.
Okay.
They're saying that Rome actually changed the calendar.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big claim.
Yeah, the transcript actually asks, what calendar do we use?
Right.
And then it identifies the Gregorian calendar as
Yeah.
the one we use.
Right. Which is the standard pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, and they point to Pope Gregory as the guy who made that happen.
And, the Gregorian calendar is the one that came later. It replaced the Julian calendar.
Yeah.
So that was a change.
So what they're saying in the transcript is that this calendar change happened to bring religious observances into line.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty big claim.
It is. Yeah, like that has huge implications.
Then the transcript goes back to this basic difference between how Passover and the Feast of Ishtar, which is now Easter, were timed.
Okay.
So Passover being tied to the lunar new moon could happen on any day of the week.
Right.
But the Feast of Ishtar, they're saying, was always on the first day of the week, which is Sunday.
Oh, interesting.
So are they saying that the papacy just decided to change the calendar so that it would match up with Easter being on Sunday?
Yeah, that's basically the argument in the transcript.
Okay.
It even suggests that the way they counted days, like maybe even the system from the Old Testament,
Yeah.
was changed to make sure that Easter was always on a Sunday.
Right.
And that would be different from Passover, which wasn't fixed to a specific day.
Right. And the source is saying that this was done on purpose,
Right.
to separate Easter from Passover.
Yeah, like they wanted to create their own thing.
Yeah. And the SDA Church Abu Aqwa transcript actually talks about this practice, they say, where they would postpone Easter by a whole week if it happened to fall on the same day as Passover.
Oh, wow.
Which I guess just really highlights this idea of a separation.
Totally.
So what they're arguing is basically that pagan traditions were mixed into Easter, and then the calendar itself was changed to match up with these pagan traditions and move away from Passover.
Yeah, and it's all pretty detailed and thought-provoking.
It really is. It makes you think about how those traditions we see today really got shaped.
Yeah, how do we remember these important events, and how do those memories change over time?
Right. So in this deep dive, we've gone from Easter as the celebration of Jesus' resurrection, the Christian understanding,
Right.
all the way back to its connection with the Jewish Passover and how it was timed based on the moon. Yeah.
Then we talked about that big decision in Rome to move it to Sunday.
Right?
And then we got into these pretty controversial ideas about its pagan origins.
Right, the Feast of Ishtar.
Yeah. And the idea that the calendar itself might have been messed with to make Easter happen on Sunday.
Yeah, and to separate it from Passover.
So I guess when you look at the big picture, what we see with Easter is this really interesting example of how religious stuff can change over time.
Yeah, you get the original beliefs, but then you also get cultural influences mixed in.
Right. And even deliberate changes to the system itself.
Yeah, that makes you think about how we understand traditions that have such complex histories.
So here's a final thought for you guys.
Okay.
We've talked about the Christian belief, the Jewish roots, the Roman decision, and then those ideas about pagan influence and even the calendar changes.
Right.
So how does knowing all of that change the way you see Easter and the traditions that you see or take part in?
Yeah, it gives you a lot to think about. It really does. And we encourage you guys to keep exploring the history and the theology behind Easter. There's always more to learn,
Absolutely.
especially when you take a deep dive.
That's right.